Hi, this is Susie. Welcome to the Luke Experiment podcast. This is the first of 7 episodes where I'll be bringing together students from different backgrounds, different perspectives to chat about their reactions to the Luke Experiment. Now, this is a reaction podcast, so if you haven't already listened to the first instalment of the Luke Experiment, I'd really recommend that you go and check that out first. It's a story. An eyewitness account of the life of Jesus written by a doctor in the 1st century called Luke, now read by a bunch of students from Cambridge University in the 21st century. You can find it at storycambridge.uk. In this episode, I sat down with Mary Hannah, who is reading the voice of Elizabeth, one of the first characters that we meet in Luke's Gospel account, and also her friend Carmen. I really enjoyed this conversation. We got thinking about some pretty big questions about what it means for us to have faith or to change our minds about what we believe about the world. And I really hope that you enjoy it as well. Let's jump in. So thanks guys for joining us. Mary Hannah, why don't you just introduce yourself to those who are listening?
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Mary Hannah. I'm the voice of Elizabeth in the recording. And as I was just listening back to it like a couple of days ago, I realized I sound very American in that. So like, massive apologies to everyone who was like, what is going on? But yeah, my name's Mary Hannah. I'm in between America and the UK sometimes. But yeah, I was the voice of Elizabeth.
That's cool. And you're in the US right now, is that?
Yeah,
correct?
I'm in Atlanta at the moment, yeah.
So fun for your year abroad.
Mm-hmm.
That's fun. Carmen, thanks so much for joining us as well. Where are you calling from? How are you doing?
Hi. I'm calling from Kent, and yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm excited to be here. It's gonna be interesting. It's gonna be nice to see everyone's sort of point of views, because obviously I've been brought up in a non-Christian household, so it will be nice to see like the different points of views regarding certain topics and stuff.
Definitely. And just I feel like you'll have such a fresh perspective as well, because I imagine, and Mary Hannah, I know you a little bit, you will have read these verses many times, but yeah, just having that like fresh insight will be really cool. So yeah, I'm glad you're excited. I'm looking forward to discussing as well. And so Mary Hannah, you're a linguist. Carmen, you study criminology. Be interesting to see whether either of those subjects brings anything particularly to bear on the subject matter. But yeah, Mary Hannah, why don't you start off? Just could you share a little bit about what your experience was reading these lines of Elizabeth? What did you learn about the character of Elizabeth through doing that?
I think for me, when I was like recording the voice of Elizabeth, one thing that I was considering was like, how would it have felt, obviously, to be her? I'm voicing a character, but more specifically in light of, I guess, like the cultural context. Like she's an older woman with like no offspring and was having a child at quite a late age. So what would that have felt like in terms of, you know, how people reacted to that? But then also the passage about like when her son is ultimately named John, and that whole situation that he doesn't take the name of his father, and how everyone's a bit confused when she says it and they're like, oh, forget you, let's see what the actual dad is saying. And then he's like, no, she's right. So I think that was what was sort of interesting for me to sort of see and imagine, and how that would have influenced, I guess, her positioning as, I guess, the mother of John the Baptist, and also how she reacted to when Mary came to visit her, because obviously like we see them as just like two mums, but they were like drastically different ages and were experiencing like this sort of miraculous thing at the same time. So just contrasting that experience was sort of interesting to me.
Yeah, that's really cool. When you at that particular moment that you picked up about the naming of John the Baptist, and so there's that situation where she's like, it's gonna be called John, and everyone's like, no, he's gonna be called after his father. And then they ask him, he's like, oh yeah, his name's John. Did you get the impression that it was that John, that Elizabeth had that conversation with him before and they decided to call him John, or that she just knew his name is John and then it turned out it was?
I think they had that conversation, or it was a revelation that was like somewhat shared. I mean, like Zachariah at this point is just not speaking, like he is mute. So I don't know like how that would have actually gone on, like probably written it something down. But I think it was a shared revelation that they had, whether it was something they received separately and then like Zachariah confirmed. I don't know, but I just think like she just knew whether they had shared it before or not.
Yeah, that's cool. Oh, so Carmen, was this the first time for you, like getting to hear these bits of the Bible, or is it something you've read before?
This was completely fresh to me. I've never heard this before. Yeah.
I love that. So was that something that surprised you? Like, how did you react when you heard that story about Zechariah and Elizabeth? She's having a baby when she couldn't have a baby before. He's had an angel visiting him, and then suddenly he can't speak because he doubted what the angel said. What were your reactions as you were reading that? What did you think of it?
Honestly, I didn't really like have much of a reaction to it, because for me this is very much just like it's just a story. I don't see it as being real. I don't believe that this actually happened. So for me, I didn't think about it as deeply as Mary Hannah or you guys would, just because for me, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it just means nothing to me, if you know what I mean. So I didn't really look into it too deeply. I just heard it as a story, and that's sort of the way I feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I like reading it in that way. Was there anything like that stood out to you in what you were hearing that you were surprised by, that you thought wouldn't be in the Bible, or that if this was going to be a true story, that maybe they wouldn't have included that detail, or that you'd have written it slightly differently?
Again, it didn't surprise me, just because to me it's never been real. So it could have had absolutely anything in it, and I would have been unsurprised. And sort of, I expect these sort of stories from the Bible, like the way I've forgotten the man's name, but how he couldn't speak. Like, I expect these sort of things, and it doesn't surprise me, just because I sort of know that these are the sort of stories that goes on in the Bible. And yeah.
Mary Hannah, is that something that you've like found as you've grown up in like reading these stories? Have you felt that similar kind of sense of, oh, it's just the sort of thing that goes on in the Bible, like it's just a kind of, I guess, a make-believe thing? Is that something that you've resonated with at all?
I think for me it's a bit different, obviously, because I grew up in a Christian household. So like as you grow up growing up as a kid, like we believe in things like Santa and the Tooth Fairy. So that sort of like belief of things that you can't really see, or the things are intangible, sort of coincided with my growing up. And so when like those things sort of fade away, it's not like it's foreign territory when you interact with biblical scriptures. I think it's as you get older, or you start to think about it more critically, or you start to have like not moments of doubt yet, and skepticism, that, as Carmen says, it's more just like, well, anything can happen in this story. Like we've had people who are like building boats when they've never seen rain and things like that. So I definitely like sympathize with what Carmen is saying, that there's sometimes you're like, oh, that's weird, but at the same time you understand that this is like the wider context of like a Bible, piece of work that is meant to be miraculous, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So when you were like growing up, was there a particular moment or period of time where you were like questioning, okay, this book's got a lot of stuff in it that's kind of feels hard to believe and it is miraculous? Was there a point where you were like, so what does that mean about, could it be true? And if so, like, how am I going to know if it's true? Are those sorts of questions the sort of things that you've wrestled with as you've grown up and decided that you are a Christian, which presumably means you do think this is true?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, it's actually been much more recent. I would say it's like more last year. And I don't think that's necessarily because my faith changed. It was more that I was just thinking about the world, thinking about my religion and myself in the wider context of like the actual world. So for me, like when I think about religion and faith, it's not really appealing to my logic. And like, that's not why I'm here. Like, I'm not here for the Bible to make sense to me in terms of my reasoning. Like, the Bible makes sense to me in terms of my spirit, like the things that I can't see. So it's sort of like, you can always debate facts and figures, but you can't debate someone's experience, if that makes sense. And so that's the way that I understand it. And so even with all of the, I guess, doubt or questions I have about like, why is the Bible violent? Why does it say these sort of things about women or sexuality or X, Y, Z? I think those are valid questions, and I will probably spend the rest of my life thinking about them or researching about them or reading about them. But I think the ultimate thing for me is that like I have enough experience that even if I wanted to like wake up tomorrow and be like, oh, God isn't real, I just wouldn't, that just wouldn't sit well with me because I have too much experience to deny that. And so that's how I sort of engage with it. So I'm like, God, I don't really understand what this means. And I trust that God is God enough to like reveal that to me in due time, but at the same time, I'm not here for like reasoning and facts. I'm here for spirit, if that makes sense.
So there's a kind of combination of what you're reading and then also what you've seen to be true in your own life. That's cool. Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about stories recently, as I'm sure many of us have, with this whole fortnight of events coming up called Story. And Carmen, I noticed that was like a word that came up in what you said about like, this is a story. And I think, yeah, when we hear that word, there are a couple of things that come into my mind. And one is like, when people, you know, like if someone tells a lie when they're a little kid and you're like, oh, they've been telling tales. I think we have that idea of a story that's fiction and isn't true in the sense of it actually happened. And then we also have the story that this is a story that did actually happen. Like if I was telling you a story of what happened to me last weekend, I'm trying to remember what actually did happen to me last weekend and I can't. But and I think actually in both of those things, in things that we're relating that did happen, and also stories that we don't think happened, it's still possible for both of those to be true or to contain truth. And I just wondered, like for you, Carmen, as you were reading, did anything stand out to you as, even if you were thinking of it just as a story that wasn't true in the sense of these things actually happening, was there anything you thought, oh, this is a good story, or oh, that's an interesting part of what's just happened in this narrative?
I mean, I thought, in terms of a story, I thought it was interesting. However, because it was so based around God, and absolutely no offense, but obviously I don't believe in him like in the slightest. So because it was so based around God, I sort of was just like, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but I was a bit dismissive of it because I was like, to me, this obviously, like I said, this isn't real. So I was just dismissive, and but it was a good story. It was an interesting story, but because of my lack of faith, I didn't find it as like interesting as say you or Mary Hannah would. But yeah,
that makes sense. I think that's a really, really great thing to be aware of as well, and not just in this matter of like reading this part of the Bible, but as we come to anything in life, any stories that we're receiving and coming to be aware of, like what we're bringing to that story. Everything we hear, we filter, don't we? Like we interpret it based on what we already believe, and those kind of deep-seated ideas of, is there a God, is there not? And other beliefs as well about, is there a morality, is there a right or wrong, or do people matter intrinsically? All these sort of really deep-seated beliefs that we come to all these different stories with. And so I just want to really just affirm what you've said there, and recognizing that you come to it with that. And it's really interesting for me, just like reading the first bit of the first chapter of Luke, because I think this book is written with all of us in mind, but with particularly those in mind who perhaps don't think this is true. So the book was written almost as a letter to this guy called Theophilus, which is a really hard name to say. And basically, Luke is saying lots of people have been telling this story about Jesus, and I've decided I really want to make this record evidence-based. I want to interrogate this thoroughly, investigate this properly. And so I've done that. He says I've carefully investigated everything from the beginning, carrying eyewitness testimonies, and I've decided to write this orderly account for you, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. So it's just really interesting hearing that, where you're coming from. And then obviously the purpose of this book is to persuade, I guess, people who are in a very similar position who might have those doubts. I don't know, what do you think about that idea of this might be written to persuade us to consider this evidence, to consider whether it might be true?
That is a good question. That's a very good question. I think that is interesting to think that it is used to persuade, and I think it is very true. I think the Bible is a way to persuade, and then on top of that, sort of as a way to control people. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because obviously everything is out to control people. There's literally everything. And yeah, I just do think I do believe that it was out to persuade people like me to become religious. However, it's difficult because for me, I know full well in my head, I don't believe obviously in a God. So reading these sort of stories isn't going to persuade me in any way, because like I said earlier, I just see them as made up stories. So it doesn't persuade me in any way, and I know many people will feel the same as me. However, I know some people will think, wow, this is interesting, maybe this is true. And I think it just depends on how you think. And I personally, I wish that I had something to believe in. I really genuinely do. I wish I could be religious and have something that it's not just us. It's not just us on the planet. I wish there was more. But obviously, people like me, we think that way, and yeah, it's a shame, but yeah.
Oh, thanks so much for your honesty, and feel free not to answer this question if you don't want to, but obviously you're expressing that, like, I'd love to believe, I'd love this sort of thing to be true, but I just don't believe it. Do you think there is anything, like what would it take, what kind of evidence would persuade you to, if there was something, if there was a God, if this was true, what would it take for you to kind of reconsider your position?
And that is a very good question, and I don't think I'd know until it happened. I can say now, I could make something up and say if I saw, I don't know, a face in a cloud, obviously that wouldn't persuade me, but I don't think I'd know, just because I so strongly believe in no God that it would have to take something quite big. However, I know other people who are sort of on the fence about it. I know it might take a little less. So personally, I wouldn't know what I'd need to believe in a God until it happened.
Yeah, it's such an important question for all of us. I think however we've grown up and whatever we've taken on as the beliefs of those around us, or as we've done our own experiencing of the world, to ask that question. I think it's such a hard question for all of us. What does it take for us to change our minds about something, especially something so kind of core? And it's really interesting. I know I've done a bit of investigating myself into the faith that I was brought up with, and these very texts in the Bible is something I've questioned and wanted to interrogate. And I remember hearing some really sort of wise people who have a lot more experience than I do telling me that these texts in the New Testament, and
especially these Gospels, they are way more kind of reliable as historical accounts than I thought, because I think I grew up with that similar idea as these are just stories. And yeah, incredible things happen in these stories, but that's sort of divorced from my real life experience. But yeah, over time and investigation, I think I've grown to decide that these are actually true events. And I'd encourage that anyone listening and for all of us to just keep asking those questions, keep asking ourselves, what does it take for me to change my mind? What kind of evidence would I need to believe that there was or that there wasn't a God? And what kind of God would that be? So yeah, maybe that's one to chew on for all of us. We haven't got loads of time, but I'd love to just hear any like questions or thoughts on the experience of listening or being part of the Luke experiment. Maybe Carmen, would you share first?
I do have a couple of questions actually.
Great.
Why do you believe in God? Like, what made you think? So obviously, like we just said, what evidence have you found that has made you believe in God?
Yeah. Do you want to answer, Marianne?
Yeah, sure. So I can start. I think for me, as I said, it's experience. It's my experience. So like, I grew up in a Christian household, and not in a Christian household that just like lived in Britain. So like, my family is from West Africa, and so knowing like the spiritual sphere in West Africa, like spirituality in West Africa is like ingrained into society, like regardless of how you view religion, like they're just inseparable. And so understanding that context, I guess, has helped me distill what is just culture and then what is something that I've interrogated in terms of like the evidence that I have found is stuff like in scripture and like Genesis, the Big Bang and the record of events in Genesis are parallel, like the order in which evolutionary scientists believe that the world came into being. It's like the Big Bang, and then this happened, that happened. There was plants before they were like living human beings, I guess, or mammals, whatever the technical terms are. That aligns with the biblical account. And they're like books like called, I think, The Science of God or stuff like that explain that much better than I can. And things like how, due to like the theory of relativism, I'm no scientist, so I'm so sorry if I'm butchering this. The theory of relativism, the 7 days that it says it took in the Bible for creation to be created is very possible that X amount of millions of years evolutionary scientists believe, because one day on Earth is like several hundred hours on a different planet. So it's just a whole bunch of sciencey things, and they break it down much better than I can. As Susie has mentioned, things like historical accounts, as in like even if someone who is reading the Bible as an atheist or a skeptic or whatever the correct term is, like these things are not detached from history. People, the question about Jesus is not about was Jesus a real man, but was Jesus the Son of God? Like any historian will respect that Jesus was a real person. And people who ask questions like, oh, but how do we know Jesus was real? Well, Jesus was essentially a pauper. He was a carpenter's he was like a carpenter's son. It's like asking, is the neighboring homeless man in 50 years, was he a real person? You might not know that beyond anything apart from eyewitness testimonies and the things that people wrote about him, maybe his birth records, things like that. But a lot of these things are things that are relatively new in terms of technology, in terms of birth records and fingerprinting, XYZ. So Jesus was essentially a peasant. So the historical records that we have, including the Bible and other non-religious texts, sort of form a historical context. And I think that's something that's really interesting. And I think the last thing that I guess keeps me in my faith or has helped me to believe is the fact that two things. One, like scripture does not record, in my opinion, powerful people. As in, like, as Carmen rightly said, it's definitely been a tool used to control. But I think that's something that's super interesting about most of history, when we think about history with a big H, is that it's been told by people who have constantly won, whereas the Israelites in the Old Testament were people who were constantly oppressed. And I think that's something that's really, really interesting to consider. And then secondly, the fact that like this biblical text, is as old as like, I think it's like 1300 BC is like the oldest transcript of like the Torah or whatever. That even through all the time that has passed, people still have something new to say about that. I don't think we'll be able to say, like, there are only so many new things you can say about Shakespeare, only so many new things you can say about Charles Dickens, but the fact that people can read it every time, and even in my life, I can read the Bible every time, the same passages every time, and recognize something new. I think that says something about a God, even if you're not sure about him or it as a being that is relatively eternal and surpasses what we understand to be time. So that's my spiel as why I believe.
fun. It's cool to see so many different facets to why you believe. And I guess you picked up on different strands there. It makes the Bible make sense of the world that you see, but also sort of experientially and as a story, you see that it bucks trends and it does something different to other literature as the Bible. Yeah, I think for me, there's probably a couple of strands in terms of how I came to believe that this story was true. And I think one of them, a key one, is learning about how incredibly reliable these texts actually are historically. I saw this graphic where it looks at all the different records of different historical people around the same time as Jesus. And so like Julius Caesar, for example, we know quite a lot about him. We believe in the stuff that's written about him, but there are very few records actually of his life, and a lot of them are written hundreds and hundreds of years after the time when he was alive. And so it's kind of, there's this discipline, academic discipline of textual criticism. And then so there's this graphic, it kind of stacked up for Julius Caesar and other sort of famous works like the Iliad and things like that from the same sort of time. And they've got, a few copies here and there, and they're written quite far after the events. And then there's just this massive bar of like all the copies of these Gospels of the New Testament. And there are so many copies, and they were written and recorded so close to the events they were describing. And so it's this kind of overwhelming picture of, wow, this text, this story is actually one of the best attested things historiographically in history, which is quite remarkable. And there's a really great book that I read called Can We Trust the Gospels, which actually I believe is being given away for free to anyone who wants to read it. And so yeah, would recommend picking that up on the website storycambridge.uk, which I read last year, and it basically just fleshes out loads of different reasons why this is a kind of reliable thing. So there's partly that I believe it's true historically, and then there's also that I believe that Jesus that we meet on these pages isn't just someone who lived and then died, but also rose again. And so there's an experience of like relationship with him, and that sounds a bit weird, I think, to those of us who aren't experienced in church lingo, Christian lingo, but seeing answers to prayer, or God healing people in response to prayer on the spot in McDonald's or in a cafe a couple of times in my sixth form as well as like feeling his presence with me. That kind of thing builds together with that historical evidence and convinces me that it is true. We have said quite a lot there, Carvin. Do you have like just any initial thoughts in response to that, or any other questions?
Yeah, I just would like to clarify. I do believe that some parts of the Bible are true. I do believe that some of it happened. I believe that Jesus was a real man and he was born, obviously. However, I don't believe the supernatural parts. So I was just wondering, like, do you guys believe like that the supernatural bits actually genuinely happened, or do you sort of just take it with like a pinch of salt?
I believe that they happened, but within a specific, I believe that they happened because I believe the Bible. So it's not so much like I believe that happened, and it's like, and I could go outside tomorrow, and if someone like said that they were like vomited from a whale like Jonah did in Old Testament, I'd be like, yeah, I believe you. Not like that sort of, I believe that it happened. I believe that it happened within the context of the Bible. And so in terms of if God is a real person, then there's nothing outside of the scope of what he can do. That's how I believe it. So within like the spiritual realm, of course, I believe that it happened. I hope that's answering your question. And I think also the fact that like the miracles that we see in the scriptures sometimes, or in the Bible sometimes, appear really glamorized, and they're like, oh, Jesus fed 5,000 people, which is like sort of incomprehensible. I guess, to think about. But I think the smaller miracles, or the things that like you encounter, people who believe in God at least encounter every day, are the sort of things that also like sort of ground my belief in like what I read in scriptures a bit more. Because if there were no miracles happening like today, I think it'd be a bit more difficult to believe. But if God is to be believed as true as people do believe that he is, then there are miracles going on today which people do witness and see and record. And so that's sort of my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, fair enough. So what sort of miracles do you see now? Because obviously you get medical miracles.
Yeah.
And for me, I just think I believe they're just a fluke. I think someone just got lucky, their body reacted well, they wanted to be alive hard enough. So I think obviously that plays a big role. But what other miracles do you see?
One miracle that I seen in terms of I saw the person which it happened to, and it was sort of surreal for me. Well, 2 actually. It was sort of surreal for me. This was when I was maybe like 11, and as I mentioned, like my family is Nigerian, so this spiritual sphere is like sort of very much ingrained into culture. And I met this man, and they were like, "Oh, you know, he died," and I was like, "What?" They're like, he literally died when he was like, I think it was maybe like 11 or 12. And I know this, like, to me, it sounds crazy. They're like, he literally died, like he was actually dead. And then I think it was either the pastor came, or the pastor came to the hospital room where he was, or something like that, or they took him there or something like that. And like, he was revived. And so it's just like, they can't really lie because he is there. Like, I met him, I shook his hand. It was at a wedding. Like, it was just a regular event that was going on. And so I just find that quite interesting. Like, he can't just, like, how is he basing his entire life on the lie that he died when he didn't? So I think like stuff like that. I mean, it's difficult to believe because you have to meet those sort of people, and not everyone's just saying like, oh, I died and now I'm alive. But then I think other things like, oh gosh, let me see, things that are less sort of like glamorous, things that I guess, as Carmen has said, can be considered coincidences, but I guess that's again how you perceive things. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something that's happened to me personally that I would say is like, I think that's a miracle. Okay, so for example, like really in like small things that to me are experiences, are like, for example, when I'm at uni and I've had like an essay that was insane, I'm having like 3 hours of sleep, and everyone knows when you have 3 hours of sleep and like no energy drinks, you're going to be dead the next day. But I have like clear memories, especially of second year, of like having 3-4 hours of sleep and being like, God, I need to like actually be awake tomorrow, and waking up feeling the most refreshed I've ever felt. And Carmen knows I don't drink Energizer or Red Bull or anything like that. Like, I barely drink alcohol, to be honest. So like, for that to happen to me is like an example of a small miracle, where people could be like, well, yeah, it's just your body kicking in, or like adrenaline, or whatever the scientific terms are. But it's happened enough times to me for it not to be debatable, if that makes sense. So those are the miracles that I see.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. But do you not believe that could potentially be just like I don't know a better term, but like a placebo effect, that you believe that it could be God? Or do you believe that it's actually God and not just a sort of placebo effect where I believe God is going to do this for me, so he's going to do it?
No, I think it's not a placebo effect, because sometimes I don't believe it's going to happen to me and it still does. And I think that's where I think what Christians believe, the scripture, faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains. Because when I wake up and I'm expecting to be tired and I'm not, or the sort of thing where I'm expected to be like yawning during my lecture and I find that I'm still awake, or something like things like that make me think like, this should not be happening to me, but it actually is, if you know what I mean.
No, that's fair enough. But also I would say that it could just be your subconscious being like, I believe God is going to do this for me, so it's going to happen. Again, like a placebo effect. But I don't know, I respect that. But obviously for me, I just see it as your mind being that way. But I mean, I can appreciate what, like, the way you're thinking about it.
I think it's really cool, like, being able to share those personal experiences. And I guess, as we were just sort of touching on before as well, it's so interesting to me just noticing how, again, we come to those experiences or those occasions with what we already believe, and then like we interpret them in the light of what we already think about reality. I'd love to spend more time thinking about that. What miracle could we see that would, beyond any doubt, convince us that it actually was a miracle, or like would we, if we have discounted them, would we just think anything? We would have to explain it away in another like reason. Or likewise, how do we know how to interpret things correctly? Oh, I love that we can't answer all these questions in the time that we have, but it's just really cool to be able to raise those, and I'm sure we'll all have time to think about them after this. But yeah, are there any other kind of thoughts that either of you would like to just bring before we say goodbye?
I just have one last thing.
Yeah,
What
great.
does it feel like to know that God is there, and like that belief? So when you're doing something and you think God is with me in this, what does that feel like? Or is it just a simple thought? Or do you feel it somewhere like in your, difficult to explain, but I hope you understand what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, Mary-Hannah, do you have anything you want to say?
For me, feeling like God is with me is more than just like a thought in terms of like, oh, God is with me, this will be cool. I think a feeling that God is with me is like knowing that your mom loves you. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, you'll forget. When you're going through your day to day and maybe you're getting caught up in a million one things as life happens, you forget that your mom loves you. But then there are things that happen, or when there are things that happen that either remind you that your mom loved you, maybe she reaches out to you, sends you a text message, whatever it is, or you reach out to her. And I think that's sort of how I relate to God in terms of like God the Father, God the being that's in the sky, what people think about when they think about God. So for me, it's like this constant assurance that just as you believe that your parents' love is unwavering, God's love and God's presence in my life is unwavering. And so sometimes it's difficult to believe in when, I don't know, you're in a difficult position, sort of like how maybe when you're in a heated argument with your parent, you're like, there's no way that this could be love. Or when you were younger and that you guys didn't see eye to eye and it was just seemed like the entire world was crashing down. That's how it was for me, at least. But that's how I understand God's presence being with me. And it's more than just a cushiony feeling, because for me, like there are a lot of things that maybe I think God wants me to do that I just would rather not do. And so knowing that God is with me is not just sort of this thing that helps me, like, that co-signs everything that I do. Because there are some times where I feel like God's like, oh, you shouldn't do that because you know that's wrong, or that's not loving, or that's mean. And there's times that I've been like, yeah, I have to apologize to that person because that was actually mean, or I was wrong, or X, Y, Z. So it's, as much as it's a comfort and it's a constant assurance, it's also like accountability. So that's how I would describe what like believing in God is always with me feels like.
That's pretty cool. I mean, that makes sense. And, I can appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Mary-Hannah, and for both of you. It's been a huge pleasure for me to just hear where both of you are coming from and hear how you've interacted with this bit of Luke. Yeah, and I hope for both of you as well, it will give you questions to chew over, and yeah, we can continue this conversation. So yeah, thanks so much, and I hope you both have a really great rest of your evenings.
Thank you, Susie. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you. See you later.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Luke Experiment podcast. To find out more and to listen to the rest of the series, head to storycambridge.uk, where there'll be a new episode released every 2 days.